Well, joining me now is Bociurkiw, who's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and former spokesman for the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Thank you very much indeed for your time this morning. Now, let's just talk about Bakhmut there, as we are in terms of the fighting there. What's the latest situation there? Very intense fighting at the moment, isn't it?
Sure, and it's a very good example of the scorched earth policy that Russia has been using since the start of the war, bombing the place to shreds, as we've seen them do in Kherson, Mariupol, and elsewhere. It's equal to attempts of genocide on the Ukrainian people. But the Ukrainians, as the report indicated, are putting up a very, very robust fight. Clearly humanitarian disaster for the people who have remained there. About 4,000 people remain without gas, power, and water. So Bakhmut has basically lost about 95% of its population. I think an essential point to make here is that, unlike the Russians, who don't value the lives of their soldiers or their people, if Ukraine sees that it's losing too many of its men, I think it will employ what's called a controlled fighting withdrawal, because, again, they value lives far, far more than the Russian side.
And, Michael, you mentioned that humanitarian crisis, so let's just explore that a little bit more. Many, as I was saying earlier on, trying to flee on foot. What's being done to help those civilians trapped in Bakhmut at the moment? What's being done to try and get them out?
Well, it's very difficult, as we've seen elsewhere where pitched battles are happening. The problem throughout this war has been that if and when humanitarian organizations do get the green light to go in and help civilians or evacuate them, what happens? The Russians tend to fire on this convoy. So it's very, very difficult for the people remaining behind, according to the mayor of that city. But for those who have left, fortunately, there are a lot of options for them inside and outside Ukraine. For example, where I am in Odesa, there's housing available. In Ivano-Frankivsk in Western Ukraine, where it's very safe, MoveUkraine.org, for example, is creating housing, sustainable housing from previously used buildings for people who want to stay in Ukraine. So those options are available to people. But one more point here. I mean, a lot of the people I've talked to, Ukrainians who have come from areas, for example, like Kharkiv, which has been heavily bombed, said they just want to be home, and they do return to areas where there is a risk of shelling. But that's pretty common in this war as well, is that people, after staying away from their original settlements, they tend to want to go home after a while.
Now, Michael, if the city does fall, what will the significance of that mean? What will this mean then for Russia and also for Ukraine?
Right. Well, I don't think it has that much of a strategic value. The Russians have been throwing everything they have at this, including losing, the Ukrainians say, 7 times more men than they have. So you can expect the Russians to really play this up propaganda-wise, as they've done with other areas in that region. But, what is happening a little bit in the wider picture is it seems that the Russians are concentrating on places like Bakhmut and the Eastern Front, rather than lobbing missiles or drones at key cities like Kyiv, Odesa, and elsewhere. So what that means is the situation has stabilized elsewhere in Ukraine, especially with power. So that's really, really important.
Michael Bociurkiw, who's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and former spokesman for the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.